What's up, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Danelle Hallan, and I am back with another true crime video. And this is an absolutely wild case, and this could possibly be a two-part video or a very long singular video. It just really depends on how much I manage to stay on track and not run my mouth. But before I get into all of the details of the case, I do need to do a little bit of housekeeping. I want to remind you guys that all of the videos that I have here can be found in podcast form. So if you would prefer to consume your content that way, all you have to do is go to your favorite podcasting platform and look up Crime Bit with Danelle Hallan. And even if you are not a podcast kind of person, you'd rather see this stuff visually, I totally understand that. It would mean the world to me if you still went and gave me a 5-star review on those platforms, followed my podcast, because I'm trying my absolute hardest this year to get these stories out to as many different audiences as I can. I also want to remind you guys that I do have a website linked down below, and that's where I have moved my case submission form. A lot of you guys have been suggesting cases lately down in my comments, and it's so easy for me to miss them entirely. So if there's a case out there that you feel needs a little bit of coverage, needs some exposure, check out my website, and everything you need to know to put it in the right hands is there. So now let's go ahead and get into this case. And when I tell you that I've probably put more hours into this case than any other case, it's been a ride, okay? I have read books, I have watched movies, I have watched documentaries, I've looked at court records. There is so much information in this case. So I really want to encourage you guys to continue to do your own research on this case afterwards. Anne Rule wrote a pretty fantastic book on this particular case. She clearly put a lot of investigative effort into it. There's actually a book written by Diane herself that I could not bring myself to read. I'm just gonna be real frank with you. There's websites, Facebook pages, documentaries, all of the things. So let's go ahead and just jump right on into it. Today, we are discussing the infamous case of Diane Downs. And I am sure that just hearing her name has evoked a physical reaction in most of you. This case is so well known. And according to a lot of your comments on a recent post I made saying that I was about to tackle this deep dive, it's one that drew many of you into true crime in the first place. I feel like the Diane Downs case and what she did to her children and how the trial played out and the investigation, all of it is just a perfect example of so many issues that we still see in true crime today. Psychological manipulation, children being used as pawns, a cat and mouse game with detectives, media portrayals that sway public emotion, and then also frustrations with a police department that seems to be doing too much and too little all at the same time. You are probably also aware that Diane Downs has been incarcerated for decades at this point. But what you probably don't know is that November 2024, so just a few months ago, she's fighting for a pretty strong chance at release, or at least having some of her counts overturned, which is a pretty damn big deal. I often discuss on my channel the aftermath of crimes, not just the crimes themselves, but focusing on how victims cope with the uncertainty of parole and the anxiety of looming release dates. However, I don't think that anyone in this case ever believed Diane would see the light of day again, so I can only imagine how the people involved feel blindsided by this possibility after decades and decades of incarceration. I don't want people to forget why she was put away to begin with and what all exactly happened. At 10:30 p.m. on May 19th, 1983, the emergency room at Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon was disrupted when a woman approached the receptionist who was trying to leave for the night, urgently explaining that someone outside seriously needed help. They were screaming and laying on their horn. The receptionist rushed outside and ended up finding 27-year-old Diane Downs beside her red Nissan Pulsar, and she was looking pale and desperate. Two of the nurses that were on shift that night, Rosie Martin and Shelby Day, followed the receptionist outside, expecting a standard emergency. They were thinking something along the lines of cardiac arrest. But instead, Diane pointed to her car and calmly stated that her children had been shot. Immediately, a code was sent out to the hospital, but they were still unaware of exactly how serious this was. That is until they finally took a look in the back seat of the car, and it was a scene that they would never forget for the rest of their lives. One of the nurses picked up a little girl from the back seat. She was limp, unresponsive, and covered in blood. This was Diane's oldest, 8-year-old Christy Downs. At this point, a doctor had also rushed outside and looked into the back and found that there was a second child. He ended up pulling 3-year-old Danny into his arms, but thankfully, Danny at least seemed to be somewhat responsive. He wasn't moving, but he was breathing and letting out the smallest cries that could barely be heard. Now, amidst the chaos, that second nurse turned to rush after the nurse, the doctor, these two children, thinking that she needed to help any way she could, when Diane abruptly stopped her. To their shock, there was a third child. Diane pointed to the front passenger seat of her car, but initially the nurse didn't see anything. All she saw was a USPS jacket laid out on the floor. But when she went around, she discovered a small child curled up underneath of it. This was 7-year-old Cheryl Downs. Just like Christy, Cheryl was unresponsive and unmoving. She felt cold. Diane pointed out to the nurse that Cheryl hadn't moved at all since she was shot. It was a scene straight from a nightmare. All 3 children were rushed into the depths of the emergency room, and it quickly became evident that all 3 of them had suffered gunshot wounds to the chest, which is the most urgent of cases. They needed every possible person to help ensure that these 3 children have the best fighting chance at life. People poured in from every single area of the hospital and beyond. I mean, there were nurses from all floors, intensive care doctors, surgeons, x-ray technicians, and even exhausted doctors that had been heading home from their long shifts overheard this commotion and turned around to help. A thoracic surgeon was also called into the hospital because they were pretty much the children's only hope, and he raced in, turning a 20-minute drive into 8 minutes. And joining him still were several other specialists from the surrounding area. It felt like all of the ER, all of McKenzie-Willamette, all of Springfield had been put on hold. And just inside of the ER doors, standing completely still staring at her children, emotionless, was 27-year-old Diane Downs. She was holding onto her own arm that was wrapped up in a towel soaked with blood, but at this point, they didn't have the staff to help her. Her wound was non-fatal, so the receptionist simply cleaned it and guided her out to the waiting room. She didn't need to see her kids in this condition, in the back of the ER, covered in blood, being worked on by dozens and dozens of people. And they needed to do something that they were able to control at this point, which was calling for help. It had only been a few minutes at this point since all of this began, so no one really knew still what exactly had happened. Was this a domestic dispute? Was someone going to follow them to the hospital and finish what they started? Was everyone there in danger? And so by 10:40 p.m., a 911 call was made to the Springfield police, and small details of how this all happened were laid out. Diane very briefly told the dispatch that she and the kids had been visiting a friend of hers in Marcola, and they decided to take the back roads home. She said that they were having a great time. She and the kids were laughing and singing. They were joking about things that Danny had said when a man jumped in front of her car and waved her down. She said she got out to see if this man needed help, but instead, they were met with violence. This man shot all 3 of her kids before turning the gun on her, and somehow she had managed to escape and rush to the hospital for help. Diane was begging for help from authorities, from hospital staff, saying that there was a crazed killer out there with a gun, and he clearly wasn't afraid to use it. Someone needed to do something. The police had to act immediately. As soon as the call with the police ended, Diane wanted to call her parents, Willadine and Wes Fredrickson. They lived just down the street, and she was going to need all of the support that she could get. Her 3 children's lives were on the line, and no one knew what was going to happen. But the receptionist didn't fail to notice that the first thing Diane said when her parents answered the phone was, quote, "He shot the kids, he shot me too." And so immediately in this moment, it seemed like Diane knew exactly who had done this to them. Authorities from the Springfield Police Department arrived to the hospital within just 8 minutes, but Diane, who was being comforted by her parents, was screaming and hysterical, expressing so much frustration that it took them so long. She already felt right off the bat that they weren't taking this shooting seriously at all. She seemed so concerned that this man was going to walk into the hospital at any moment. And so confused confusion just continued to erupt in the ER as they tried to determine where the attack took place, the exact details of what happened, and the condition of the children. So much was up in the air. People were literally running back and forth through the ER. It seemed impossible to get a hold of the situation. And just when they thought they finally had it under control, they realized that this crime actually occurred outside of city limits. So yet another shuffle began as Lane County Sheriff's Office was called in to take over the investigation. So now, with proper authorities at the hospital, Diane finally was able to say what happened in much more detail. Diane explained to Detective Doug Welch, who would go on to lead the investigation, that she had gone to specifically a friend named Heather Plord's house. Heather lived in Marcola, which is an area about 20 minutes northwest of Springfield. She said that Heather had mentioned to her the fact that she wanted to purchase a horse. I think they both worked together at the local USPS office, and Diane just so happened to see an ad for free horses in the newspaper, and she decided, since Heather didn't have a phone, she was going to take her kids after dinner to drop off this newspaper clipping that she had. And so that's what they did that night. Diane said that after she arrived, Heather ended up telling her she already had a horse, which of course made all of the kids super excited. Horses were actually a big part of Diane's life, something that she loved. And so they all spent a little bit of time loving on the horse. And then around 9:30 p.m., Diane said she packed everyone back into her Nissan Pulsar and headed home. Now, she told Detective Welch that she decided to take the scenic route home. The Four Musketeers, as she loved to call herself, and her kids apparently loved cruising along back roads. They loved to go sightseeing. It was just one of their things that they did together. However, unlike she had previously told the hospital, the dispatcher, and Springfield Police Department when they thought they had jurisdiction, she now claimed that the kids had actually fallen asleep during the ride. There was no longer the story that they all had been awake and laughing and joking together over something Danny said. Now, it had just been Diane, quiet in the car. This time, she was also able to provide the sheriff's department with a more specific location of where the shooting occurred, because up until this point, she seemed very confused. She wasn't able to say for certain, but now she seemed pretty confident. Diane said that she saw a road off of Marcola when they were sightseeing, and she had never been down this road before. This was Old Mohawk Road, which is only a couple miles long. It's pretty short, and the road primarily consists of farmland running alongside the Mohawk River. There's like a handful of houses sparsely placed along it. Some of it is open, wide open and clear, and other parts of it are wooded. Overall, it's a pretty rural road. So with Diane in a stable condition and the kids being actively treated, Diane, her father, and detectives jumped in the car so that she could show them exactly where the shooting occurred. And on the way out, the ER still tense, people still checking over their shoulders for a shooter possibly hiding in the shadows, Diane paused to look at her Nissan. It was still parked in front of the hospital, and you might think, okay, she's reliving the horrid night that she saw. She sees this and goes into hysterics, but that's not at all what happened. Instead, she just looked at her car and casually said that she was so upset her brand new car was ruined, which seemed like a wildly inappropriate statement for a mother to say, something so bizarre to be concerned about when her 3 children were in the hospital fighting for their lives. Now, since the attacker hadn't shown up at the hospital and Diane hadn't seen another car during the shooting, authorities were worried that this man may still be wandering around Old Mohawk, and Old Mohawk leads directly into the city of Springfield. And while there aren't many houses down Old Mohawk itself, obviously the closer you get to a city, the more the population increases, and they were worried that he would go on to find other victims. They didn't know if this guy was out there on a killing spree or if this was just a targeted attack, but at this point, they couldn't really take any chances. Now, Springfield Police Department, despite not actively leading the investigation, had already sent dogs out to comb through this area because this is still Springfield. Like, this is still a community they need to protect. And if this attacker was nearby, they wanted to find him as soon as possible. So they were out searching. Diane, her father, and detectives were looking out into the darkness on their trip as well, and state police had also already been called in to aid in the search. But so far, no one seemed to be finding a thing. There was no sign at all of this gun-wielding stranger. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, 2 of the 3 children were fighting for their lives. But for one, it unfortunately had just been far too late. Nurses had desperately worked on 7-year-old Cheryl. She had suffered suffered 2 gunshot wounds to her back, one over her right shoulder and the other under her left. They attempted to clear her airways. That was kind of like step 1 at trying to stabilize her, but they just kept pulling out one coagulated blood clot after another, which was so puzzling for the hospital staff because when you work in any sort of trauma, if you work in the ER and you have like gunshot victims coming in and all of these extreme emergencies, typically they're rushed to the hospital. And so you see fresh blood. It didn't make sense that there was so much old blood in Cheryl's throat. By the time a doctor managed to come and see Cheryl for himself, which wasn't very long at all, and saw the location of her wounds and what they were finding, he had to call it. There was nothing that they could do for that sweet little girl. She was already gone. So they turned all their focus onto Christy and Danny. 3-year-old Danny was so confused and crying. Danny had a gunshot wound just centimeters away from his spine, and it was clearly a pretty close shot because they could still see the soot from the shot on his skin around the wound, but thankfully it had missed all of his vital organs. So he wasn't in an emergent situation in that way, but if his spinal cord started to swell, which was very likely, the possibility of paralysis was huge. So they worked hard to stop the bleeding, get him stable, and prevent that swelling as much as possible. Because toddlers love to run, they love to play, and imagine them trying to understand at such a young age that all of a sudden they just can't do these things. And then there was 8-year-old Christy. She was so close to death that they thought she was already dead when they carried her into the hospital. And even her small signs of life that she did show were very quickly fading. Her pupils that had once reacted to light had stopped and dilated. She only took occasional gasps for air, and she had no blood pressure. As they worked, they discovered that she too had been shot twice in the chest, and then a third time in her left thumb, which was possibly a wound that she sustained from defending herself, holding her hand up in protection. So there was a huge chance that Christy had actually seen her attacker and would be able to identify them if she made it through. And that was a huge deal, but again, at the moment was not the top priority. They were able to determine that one lung was hemorrhaging and the other had collapsed. So she was in the process of bleeding out internally. And to the devastation of everyone, her heart stopped beating. More nurses and doctors rushed to Christy. The thoracic surgeon had finally arrived, all of them working to frantically provide air to her collapsed lung. They started blood infusions, several other life-saving procedures, and attempted to restart her heart. And by some miracle, her heart began to beat again. And once she was finally stable enough, she was taken into surgery. At this point, the future for both Christy and Danny was unknown. Danny could be paralyzed minutes from now, hours from now, weeks from now. Christy ended up suffering a stroke just after surgery that resulted in a loss of speech and entire feeling in one of her arms. Things could continue to change every single minute, but no one in this hospital was going to give up. Now, at this point, the Lane County Sheriff's Department was also at the hospital. They were taking photographs of Cheryl, the children's clothing, and they were collecting evidence, which included a .22 caliber casing that had been tangled up in the children's clothes. And so this was one of the first big wins for the Sheriff's Department. They were at least able to narrow down the caliber of weapon that was used, but finding out who was behind it was going to be much more challenging. When Diane finally returned back to the hospital from locating where the attack occurred, she finally learned of her daughter's passing, and everyone had kind of been bracing themselves for this moment. They'd already known Cheryl passed before Diane left, but they didn't want to say anything to her yet. They wanted her to be able to kind of level out a little bit, speak to authorities, and then have a moment before breaking this awful news. And so they had expected the gut-wrenching cries of a mother in grief, something that they unfortunately probably experienced more than they ever wanted to. But those cries never came. Diane never showed a sign of emotion and even made an offhanded statement that that was supposed to be her athlete. Those around her hoped at this point that this was just a reflection of unique coping mechanisms, a different way to process her sorrow. rather than an indication of something far more sinister. But this gut feeling that something was up with Diane was unfortunately one that never, ever went away. Now, in the hours that followed this, Diane spoke nonstop to authorities, not just about the crime, but they kind of learned the basic details about her. She had moved to Springfield just 8 weeks prior from Chandler, Arizona, to be closer to her parents. Her father was a postmaster, and she had worked with USPS for a while now, so he was able to get her a job immediately in that area. She had also recently gone through a divorce from her husband and the father of her children, Steve Downs, and according to her, it had been a pretty tumultuous relationship. She had hoped that this move was going to be a good thing for her, a good thing for her kids, a fresh start, and instead, it turned into this nightmare. Diane continued to provide authorities with additional details about the crime as well. It seemed like the more she talked, the more she would remember new things. And now she was suddenly remembering seeing a small yellow car ahead of her that may have belonged to an attacker. And so authorities at this point are worried that they're out there searching on Old Mohawk Road when this person could be long, long gone. But then she told authorities that she had seen this man. Diane proceeded to describe her attacker as a bushy-haired stranger with a round face. She said that he had shoulder-length hair, potentially like a bang sort of situation happening. He was maybe 5'9" and weighed around 150 to 170 pounds. But not just that, she saw and remembered what he was wearing. She said that he wore a dirty Levi's jacket, a t-shirt, and that he also had stubble on his face. But despite her statement that she said on the phone to her parents that he shot me and he shot the kids, Diane claimed that she didn't recognize this person at all. Now, she ended up telling detectives that this man kind of stood in front of her car waving out of nowhere. She didn't know where he came from. And so she decided to stop her vehicle and she got out to see if he needed assistance, leaving her sleeping children behind in the car. But she said that she turned the car off and took her keys just as a safety precaution. And so she again said that this man demanded to have her car. Like the moment he walked up to her, it was, "Give me your keys." And she looked at him just incredulous, like, "Absolutely not. What are you talking about? Like, have you lost your mind?" And so within seconds of her denying this man the keys, he walked over to the driver's seat, reached in through the window, and began shooting at the children. Diane said that he then turned the gun to her, fired 2 shots. One missed, and the other struck her in her arm. Now, at this point, she knew that her kids were hurt, so she said that she had to find a way to escape. So she pretended to throw her keys into a nearby bush, and the moment he was distracted, she kicked and pushed him away and then jumped in the car. And from that point, she raced like hell down these back roads, desperately wrapping her arm with a towel and hoping that her kids would be okay. Now, during this time that she was speaking to authorities, Diane couldn't even remember which of her daughters had died, Cheryl or Christy. It was just such an overwhelming moment for every single person involved. This was not the kind of thing that happened in Springfield. I mean, this kind of thing doesn't happen pretty much anywhere other than in very rare occurrences. Her entire story was so heartbreaking, every parent's worst nightmare. No one could fathom the agony of witnessing a stranger shoot your children. Authorities swabbed her hands for trace metals that might indicate that she had fired a gun, which is just standard procedure, and all tests came back negative. They also asked Diane if she owned any guns. They wanted to just make sure, it's very typical procedure in situations like this. 9 times out of 10, an abduction, a murder is by a family member, especially of a child, or, someone that's incredibly close to them. And so she admitted that she did, in fact, have guns. She had a .22 rifle at home and a .38 revolver locked in the trunk of her car. And because they knew at this point that a .22 had been found in the children's clothing, that was the kind of bullet removed from one of the children, they wanted to see that .22 rifle, just to be sure. Sometime in the early morning hours, Diane was taken back for treatment, and an eerie feeling washed over the emergency room yet again. The doctor who had just worked on her children, had just called Cheryl's death, was expecting to walk into a hysterical mother. The same kind of scenario that everyone expected when they had to break the news to Diane that Cheryl was dead. But instead, he found Diane sitting there, emotionless, flat, with no tears and no signs of distress. And the first thing that she said, just like the bizarre statement she said when they walked past her car, was, "Man, I really ruined my new car. There's blood all over the back. But still, despite all of the odd things that Diane was saying, she was more than willing to talk. She was eager to help them locate the man who had done this to them. She had provided a wealth of information for authorities to begin their investigation, including this crazy detailed description. And so most people were really kind of holding on to this hope that her unusual behavior was just due to trauma that she was experiencing. But authorities at this point already had started questioning the validity of her story. Lane County Sheriff's Department was struck by how casually she had retold the events of that night. Once Diane started talking, Diane didn't stop. And some of the things that she had stated to the hospital staff and authorities, like some of the things I've already shared, seemed wildly inappropriate considering the circumstances. There were also quite a few things just within her statement and the story herself that were not making sense. On the surface, if you looked at what Diane said, if you zoomed out and took this wide, broad view of it, it might look plausible. A stranger by the side of the road in the middle of nowhere asking for help could certainly have bad intentions. It's a tale as old as time. You see it in the movies. But when you examine the details more closely, when you zoomed in, it was not adding up. Diane had claimed that she and her kids had taken these back roads for sightseeing. But when she did this, it was 9:30 p.m., it was dark outside, and they were in the middle of nowhere. Who on earth goes sightseeing on backcountry roads at night? What exactly are you seeing there? You can barely see the road in front of you. And it also seemed odd, just in general, that as a woman alone in the car with her 3 children, she would stop and physically get out of the car with a stranger. It's one thing to ask if someone's okay through the window, especially when you have vulnerable children with you, but the fact that she just so eagerly hopped out of the car with her keys in hand, ready to talk to this complete stranger, seemed really questionable. Also, why had she so drastically changed her story already? In the original version that she told to several people in the hospital, her kids had been laughing and joking with her literally up to the moment she stopped for this man, which meant that they very likely saw their attacker. That was a huge deal. So that was a detail people were really clinging on to. But in her more recent story, they were all suddenly asleep. They likely wouldn't be able to tell authorities a thing. And Diane herself said that she knew that she had to remember all these details because she was going to be the only one to talk to police. So why were the details already changing? And most importantly, probably out of everything, is why did the attacker target the children first? And how on earth did they even know the kids were there? It was incredibly dark. This is a country road. There are no street lights. Maybe there was moonlight. And by her own account, her children were lying across the seats asleep. Even in the hospital's bright lights, the nurses had missed Cheryl in the front of the car, in the floorboard. So how on earth did a stranger standing feet away from the car within just seconds manage to take note that there were 2 kids lying down in the back in the dark and one tucked underneath the floorboard? And even if by some chance this person did manage to see them, if you want to play devil's advocate, why on earth would he choose to harm them first? If this assailant had demanded the car from Diane, like she said, and she refused, the most logical response would be for him to try to overpower her. She was face to face with this guy, holding the keys, blocking his path from what he wanted. She would be able to identify him. She would have a chance to fight back. So you would expect him to at least shoot her first, rather than immediately turning to the kids and kind of leaving himself that much more vulnerable. Which then led to the question of how did this person manage to almost fatally shoot all 3 children in the same area, and Diane only sustained an arm injury. It was also not lost on them that Diane had made it a point to wrap herself up as she drove to the hospital, but she left her children unattended. She also didn't say that she made any attempts to stop this man from shooting her kids. He would have had to walk straight toward the car, straight toward her, past her with a gun out, and she just stood and watched. A lot of the things that Diane was claiming to do, her lack of emotion, her lack of action when this was happening to her children, it just felt like it was completely lacking maternal instincts altogether. Also, just statistically, a stranger carjacking turned murder, an attempted murder of 4 people, is not something that happens very often. And to put this into perspective for you guys, I did a little bit of research on the statistics specifically regarding this. According to the DOJ, from 1987 to 1992, which was the closest I could get, only 18% of carjacking victims were injured, and only 4% suffered a serious injury. Majority of people walk away from carjackings unharmed. So none of this was sitting right with authorities. And so the only way they could really plausibly look at what Diane was saying was that maybe carjacking wasn't the motive, and maybe this was a targeted crime. But who would have reason to target Diane and her kids when she was only living in this area for 8 weeks? Who could have known that she was going to Heather's? A last-minute decision that she made. And this wasn't a time where there was social media and cell phones and everyone was, communicating about their every move. And on top of that, who would know that she was going to decide to take back roads home and within seconds make a decision to turn down this one random road, and somehow they were able to perfectly place themselves in front of her? It didn't seem plausible at all, no matter what way you looked at it. And then there was the timeline. Diane admitted that she had left Heather's at around 9:30 p.m. and she didn't get to the hospital until around 10:30, so an hour later. The hospital was only 20 minutes away from Heather's house and 10 minutes from the shooting site. So did they really drive around sightseeing for 30 to 40 minutes, all in the same small area? Or is there a strange missing piece of timeline here? And when you add that to the presence of coagulated blood with Cheryl, it just felt like every detail raised another red flag. It seemed to authorities like the kids had possibly been lying in the car after being shot for a hell of a lot longer than just the 10-minute drive it would have taken to reach the hospital, especially if, according to Diane's claims, she was flying there. So at this point, authorities started to kind of consider who may have committed such an act, something so awful. Could it be a stranger, a lover, an ex-partner? But they also wanted to keep a close eye on Diane because they were kind of worried at the time that maybe she wasn't directly involved, but maybe she was lying for someone, maybe she had been threatened by somebody, and they weren't the only ones that were noticing these strange things and considering this possibility. They noticed weird things the hospital did, and even her own father, by his own admission in an interview, said that first night he wondered if Diane was involved. He actually was the one who asked them to do a GSR test on her. And I feel like you don't just assume that and jump to that possibility unless there's been something in the past that made you feel like she was capable of doing something like this. And so right away, authorities jumped into an investigation into not just the crime, but also Diane's background. Local authorities spent the entire night searching the fields and going door to door on Old Mohawk Road. However, no one reported seeing anything suspicious that night, including Diane racing past or any yellow car like she had described. They also decided to send officers out to Heather Plourt's home in case the attacker was maybe lurking around there. If this had been a targeted crime, maybe they had been the intended targets and it was like a case of mistaken identity. But thankfully, Heather's family was completely fine and all was clear. Officers were also dispatched to Diane's home. They wanted to retrieve the gun that she said was there, this .22 rifle. And upon entering her home, things became even more puzzling. Although she had moved in just 8 weeks prior, the state of the home suggested that they had just moved in the night before. Boxes were still piled up unpacked, and the only furniture downstairs was a TV and a chair. And I'm one to try to not jump to conclusions and make assumptions. She had just gotten out of a bad relationship, a bad marriage that she had been in for years. Maybe she just didn't have a lot of furniture that she called her own. But again, when you kind of zoom in and take a look at all of the details, I just kind of doubt that was the situation. And one of the things that was a little bit odd is that on that TV, there were 4 pictures. And so officers were kind of expecting to find family photos, but instead it was 2 headshots of Diane and 2 pictures of an unknown man. Why were there no pictures of the kids, and who the heck was this guy? In the kitchen, they couldn't even find enough food to prepare even one meal. The fridge contained several half-full open cans of food, all of which had molded over, but there was pretty much nothing else in the house. There was a sign that there was like an open can of, I think, Chef Boyardee in the trash can, which was likely what they ate that night. And then in the coat closet downstairs, they stumbled upon another puzzling discovery. Instead of finding children's coats or winter gear to kind of get through the Oregon winter season and rain, they found women's lingerie, which just kind of seemed like a bizarre thing to have down there. None of this was what they expected to find from a home filled with 3 young children. No toys, no drawings, no evidence that they played and lived a full life there. But at this point, they couldn't really speculate as to what any of that meant. Again, is this just because, she's struggling and coming out of a bad marriage? She's trying to find a way on her own? Or was there something more behind this? And at this point, all they really had to focus on and could focus on was finding the shooter and making sure that this .22 rifle didn't somehow match up to the murder weapon that shot these children. And so they went upstairs to where Diane told them the gun was. And again, to their shock, they found that unlike the rest of the house, Diane's room was fully unpacked. It was beautifully decorated. She had her bed done nicely. All of her things were laid out, which again, just something interesting to note. And I believe underneath the bed is where they located this .22 rifle. This rifle was covered in dust. It had not been fired in a long time. And so they knew this could not have been the weapon used to harm the children. The only other item that they took from the home this particular night was on Diane's request. She kept speaking to everyone about her diary. She wanted people to know about this diary. And so they grabbed it, but not before making several copies of it. An analyst arrived at the hospital around this point to just conduct a quick overview of the car before sending it off to a crime lab. And they were also able to find that .38 revolver that Diane mentioned was in the trunk, and it was just another dusty, unused gun. And they also found several more .22 casings scattered around the vehicle, just further confirming the type of weapon used in the crime. So the car was sent off to the lab, and at this point, they started to focus on everyone's safety. For the protection of Diane and her children, they decided to assign security to sit outside of each of their rooms at all times to make sure this bushy-eared stranger couldn't walk into the hospital and harm anyone any further. By the early morning hours, authorities had the opportunity to interview Diane's parents. Now, Willadine explained that it was very routine for her to watch the kids during the day so that Diane could go and work her shift running her route for the local postal service. And the 19th, the day in question, had been no different at all. Diane would drop the children off at their grandparents' house early in the morning, and the girls would eat breakfast there, get ready, and they would leave for school, while Danny would spend the day with Willadine. Typically, after this, the entire family would eat dinner together, but on this night of the 19th, the Fredricksons apparently already had plans. So Diane and her kids had been on their own that night. The Fredricksons hadn't noticed anything unusual, any strange behavior. Everything felt normal otherwise. Wes agreed with everything that Willadine said, and he also was able to confirm that Diane only had two guns that authorities had already found, the .38 handgun and the .22 rifle. But he said she had those guns to protect herself from her ex-husband, Steve Downs. And so, obviously, the next person they wanted to speak to was Steve. If this had been a nasty divorce, like Diane had said, a nasty marriage, maybe he had done the absolute unthinkable. If she moved away and took their children, he had motive for the crime. And coincidentally, that same morning, Steve Downs had arrived from Arizona. He spoke to authorities about his tumultuous relationship with Diane, but he really didn't have a lot of contact with her anymore. He said they communicated a handful of times since she moved, but it was mainly regarding their children's well-being, health, and he'd only seen her in person once since her relocation when she took a very brief trip to Arizona, like 24 hours, and she stayed at his house. He seemed genuinely worried for his kids and was able to provide a solid alibi for the night before. He was states away on a date with a woman. And not only was this woman able to confirm this, but the restaurant or the bar that they were at confirmed it. And it sounded like Steve had a roommate as well, who was actually one who got the news and had to break the news to Steve. So at the very least, he wasn't the physical hand behind the gun. Now, like everyone else, authorities asked Steve what firearms Diane had, and he confirmed that she had that .22 rifle and the .38 handgun. But then he also mentioned she had a .22 Ruger handgun. And he was aware of this because it had once belonged to him. Steve went on to explain to investigators that the rifle and the .38 had actually been Christmas presents from Diane. I think she gave them to him their last Christmas together about a year or so before. And the .22 Ruger handgun was a present that he had received from a client. Now, he said that he had shown her how to use all of these guns and that she often carried them for protection on her postal routes. It was routine for them to kind of trade off guns back and forth, even when they were on and off in their relationship. Sometimes she would have them, sometimes he would have them. It doesn't really seem like there was ever like communication about this. They just kind of fluidly went back and forth. But he knew that she had to have the rifle and the .38. She took those with her. And he said that the last time he saw that .22 Ruger was when it was in her hands during a dispute they had, I guess, when she shot it through the floor of her trailer bathroom. So he believed that she had to have had it with her in Oregon because it was nowhere in his home. So at this point, authorities are like, okay, is Steve lying to get out of the spotlight? Is he trying to make it seem like Diane had the gun so he didn't have the gun? Or did Diane have a gun matching the potential murder weapon and had lied about it? Authorities also asked Steve if he believed Diane was capable of harming their children, and he very firmly stated that there was no way she would do this. But authorities still had one final question for him, and it seemed to kind of crack open a can of worms. Diane had a tattoo of a rose on her shoulder with the name Nick underneath of it, and she had very specifically told doctors to not tell her dad about the tattoo when they were treating her arm in the hospital. They had also started to briefly flip through her diaries, and they contained almost daily unsent letters to this same man, in which she just professed her love for him time and time again, every day, just pages and pages of letters to Nick. And around the time that she moved from Arizona to Oregon, it became evident there had been a falling out, and it seemed to kind of confirm itself only weeks before this incident occurred. And so they wanted to know who this Nick person is to see if he may possibly be involved. Steve revealed to authorities that he knew of Nick all too well. Nick was a married man that Diane worked with at the postal office in Arizona, and they had been having a pretty steamy affair for a year before she left. Naturally, authorities wondered if Nick might have information about Diane and what happened. Maybe he was upset over the move, or maybe there was a jealous, angry wife that could have lashed out. And they were also able to quickly put two and two together that Nick was the same man in those two photos on Diane's TV. So between the photos of him and the gushing diary about her love for him, it seemed like they had been in a really close relationship. So if something big had happened, there again could be motive here. And at the very least, he might have insight on who would want to harm her and her kids. He had been the last person to be incredibly close with Diane. At this point, news of the attack on Diane and her 3 children had spread, and it was inciting anger and fear within the public. Diane was receiving an outpouring of flowers and cards offering support to help her through the loss and the hard times ahead. The media absolutely descended on this situation. They were eager to gather any bits of information that they could. A sketch of the man in question that Diane helped create was circulating in the media, and this was creating just a sense of unease and horror in the town. But to authorities, this was yet another bushy-haired stranger, known as the acronym BHS through departments nationwide. BHS is this well-known phenomenon of sorts, a ghost suspect that typically can never be found conveniently, or in other words, a BHS was a scapegoat. And so authorities were not so sure about the sketch that they had put out to the public and that this was actually a real person. Now, despite the public's demands for updates and information, authorities remained very tight-lipped as they navigated the investigation. DA Fred Hughey had been assigned to the case, and it was actually his very first homicide investigation, and he seemed to be a very level-headed person. He didn't want to rush into a conviction. He wanted to make sure he had a solid case. Like, he was the very calm and collected, cross your T's, dot your I's kind of guy. And as he awaited evidence and information to start kind of forming his own investigation, he spent hours daily sitting at the bedsides of Danny and Christy. Fred Hughey had decided with his wife that they didn't have time for kids. They were both so focused on their career, but seeing this case, seeing these kids turned his world upside down. And from that moment, he took a vow to protect Danny and Christy at all costs. And this was a vow that he held on to with a vice grip. Searches in the area of the shooting continued, but they just still kept on coming up empty. There were search teams out there, Ellie, they even had the Boy Scouts out there standing arm in arm doing grid searches in the fields. They were thinking of places where someone might want to bury a weapon. I mean, every area a gun could possibly be thrown. They also sent divers down into the river because where the crime occurred was literally a stone's throw away from the Old Mohawk River. So that seemed like the most logical place for someone to toss a gun. But when it wasn't wasn't located there. They risked their lives in the rushing water under the Hayden Bridge, but again came up empty-handed. The killer at this point had either taken the gun with them or it had floated downstream. Authorities decided to go back and speak to Heather, who had last seen Diane and her kids, and she noted, just like everyone else, that nothing seemed off. Diane didn't seem to have been followed by anyone. She didn't seem to be worried about anything, but it did seem like she had somewhere to possibly be, which easily could have been home to get her kids in bed. And she was able to place Diane leaving her home sometime around 9:40 that night. Neighbors of Heather's also confirmed that they heard Diane's car door slam at around 9:40, so at least the timeline seemed to be somewhat consistent here. There were also a handful of leads as well, people calling in to swear that they recognized this bushy-haired stranger in the sketch, or that they saw a strange yellow car on Old Mohawk Road. But each lead that authorities followed up on ended up being a fluke. People were off by a week, or the person they saw actually looked nothing like the description, or that person hadn't been seen in the area in months. The local school also had a huge task on their hands. These were 3 children, one of them no longer living, 2 of them had been through a traumatic experience, and they had classmates that had to kind of be in the middle of all of this. So they sent counselors out to talk to the classmates about Christy, about Cheryl, to help them through the trauma and the loss as well. So many people were in fear over what happened. So many people were grieving this tragedy, and a lot of pressure was on the sheriff's department from the public to solve the case. And strange actions by Diane just kept inching them towards her. Officers had constantly been at the hospital watching Diane and the kids. And when Diane had finally gone down to visit her children, she first went to see Christy. Officers and hospital staff watched as she went over and grabbed Christy's hand in hers, and then stared Christy straight in the eyes. And the only thing she said over and over again was, "I love you." But they noticed that the body language again just seemed off. She was so tightly gripping Christy's hand, and she was saying "I love you," but it was through clenched teeth. And despite the fact that Christy could not talk, she was unable to communicate, there were other things they noticed that showed that Christy was having some sort of reaction to her mother. Christy's heart rate had steadily been at 104, and when her mother walked in the room, her heart rate spiked to almost 150, and it didn't fall until she left. Questioning Diane at this point also turned into an Olympic event. Investigators had tried to go and see her in her hospital room, but they could really barely get a word in through her own, what they described as word vomit. She retold the same stories over and over again. She used the same exact phrases over and over again. Everything was just a repetition. She seemed to direct every single conversation in whatever way she let the wind take her. And that was between the times when she would take calls and, speak with friends and speak to the media, and she took a moment to place new flower arrangements around her room. The dynamic just was so bizarre and different from anything the authorities had ever really experienced before, as well as the hospital staff. And the moment Diane was released from the hospital, her living room at her parents' turned into a full production set. It kind of started to feel like Diane was the main character. She was the star in this movie. Media was always set up, and Diane was always ready to speak. I'm talking within days of being released from the hospital. And speaking to the media in and of itself is not inherently bad, but she just had this air about her. Diane had just lost a child. She could still lose Christy at any moment, and Danny would likely never walk again. But Diane just seemed so emotionally unfazed, so emotionally unaware. She would show up dressed to the nines in full hair and makeup. She would laugh and, make jokes and give these sly glances to the camera.
We like to take back roads and just went down that road. And there was a guy standing in the road, flagging me down, so I stopped. Everything was done in a matter of 5 or 10 seconds. He swung himself around and fired twice. One caught me in the arm, the other one I went off somewhere. Danny cried the whole way. I could hear him softly just moaning, and Christy was dying. God, all the blood here, just to appeal for people out there to, if they know anything, to call in.
But the public bought right into it. They felt for this mother who seemed so strong and so resilient, a mother that was unafraid to put her face on the news time and time again for her attacker to see, knowing she might be targeted again. I mean, she was saying all these things like, we're going to find him. And, all of these bold statements that a lot of people would probably be horrified to say. And it was really inspiring to a lot of people. And they're thinking, wow, this mom really, really loves her kids. She is going to do anything it takes to find out who hurt them. But very quickly, there seemed to be kind of this transformation in the case. Authorities weren't really speaking much to the media. It didn't seem like they were progressing, at least to the public's eye and Diane's eye, into actually finding this bushy-haired stranger. And so Diane was getting frustrated. She was frustrated that nothing was happening. And she knew she had the media in her pocket. She knew she had the public in her pocket. So she started to use that to her advantage. Diane began to throw accusations at the sheriff's department for not finding this man fast enough, saying that they weren't following her suggested leads. And she was making a lot of bold statements. She was saying she would go out there and do it herself. I mean, it was absolutely wild, some of the things that she said and the confidence with which she said them. And she even started to hurl accusations at the hospital. It was like every single interview just became more and more unhinged. She accused the hospital of purposefully paralyzing Danny. She started to say that all the therapists and people that were there to help her children, the same people that saved them and were maintaining their well-being at the moment, were brainwashing her kids. She didn't want her children at the hospital anymore. She didn't want them speaking to detectives anymore. And so while Diane was kind of spinning this narrative of what a great mother she was and how she was just doing all of this to protect her children, and she was yelling so loudly and demanding so many things because she knew better and she did better, authorities quietly sat knowing that how she was portraying herself was all an absolute act. Diane had already done so many strange things, but authorities had been slowly just compiling more and more information. They had brought Diane in to do a reenactment of the attack, and it is probably one of the strangest reenactments that I have seen to date. They had started to work on forensics in the case, and so they wanted a demonstration of how it happened from someone that was there to kind of see if the forensics were matching up, to make sure, everything was going right, a place to start. But right away, it was just another scenario where Diane made sure she was the main character. As they started this recording, and this is just days after this all happened, you can see Diane in the front seat of the car, and she is primping herself. She's getting camera ready. She proceeded to fully act out the attack, something that, again, psychologically should have brought up some serious emotions. It's reliving a very traumatic event, the same traumatic event that caused her to lose a child. But instead, Diane was treating it like she was in an action movie.
4 days after her 7-year-old daughter was killed, Downs is filmed reenacting the attack.
Sitting in the car is Elizabeth Diane Downs, one of the victims of this attempt murder.
I'm throwing the keys, okay? I'm throwing the keys.
Simulating, yeah?
Yes, I go like that. I got in the car, jumped in, put the keys in. I just hit my cast. Started the car and left. The car door shut itself.
And she went on to say, quote, "This is almost worse than," and then she ducked her head and she didn't finish her sentence. And authorities were flabbergasted. Worse than what, Diane? As authorities continued to narrow their focus on Diane, she could tell and just continued to adjust accordingly. At this point, she was just downright aggressive, not just in the media, but in the hospital itself. And she was acting so bizarrely. At one point, Diane approached Christy's doctor and asked him to pull the plug on her. She went on to say, "I know Christy's brain dead. I don't want her to suffer. I'm her mother. I love her too much." And they were just like, "What are you talking about? Christy is not brain dead." No one had ever told her that. No one had ever given her the impression Christy wasn't going to make it in that immediate moment. And when the suggestion was gawked at, Diane became infuriated. She threatened to remove both Danny and Christy from the hospital and the machines that they relied on to live. Fred Hughey also realized at this point what a sensitive situation the kid's mental state was in. Like, this was something that had been recognized from the beginning. And so he brought in the best of the best. There was a wonderful woman in law school who just had this way with kids. And so he approached her and was like, "Hey, the DA has no money to offer you to do this for us, but we need you to come and help us. And so this woman took time out of her personal life to sit with these children daily, getting nothing in return. She was comforting them, calming them, playing with them, hoping to gain their trust. And that's just something that you have to do with children. They're not just going to open up to any random person. You have to gain their trust. They rely on adults. This is not anything different than what would happen with literally any other situation. But Diane absolutely couldn't stand it. She hated this woman, and this woman even brought Christy a stuffed animal, something comforting to have in the hospital, and Diane threw it across the room. It became pretty evident that Diane didn't want Christy to speak to anyone about what was happening. She had even decided that she didn't want the kids to have security altogether. Just the way that Diane was acting was wildly bizarre. You would think that a mother that wants to identify her attacker that harmed her, killed one of her kids, would want to encourage her kids to feel safe sharing what they saw, would want therapists and qualified individuals to be there to be that comfort, to help them. A mother that was horrified that a killer was out there targeting her kids would want her kids to have round-the-clock security. So why didn't she? Why was she so against all of it? So with all the strange details, just kind of regarding the possibility Diane may be involved or have information about what happened to her and her children, and the fact that she seemed actively ready and had threatened several times to come and legitimately unplug the kids and take them home with her, they decided at this point an emergency order was necessary. Diane was coming into the hospital wreaking havoc. And so this order was put in place, custody was taken from Diane, and there were very specific restrictions about how she was able to visit her children.
During her brief courtroom appearance today, Mrs. Downs offered no protest of the petition to place her children in the protective custody of the doctors and the hospitals providing their medical care. That petition was filed last week by the district attorney's office because it was believed the children were not safe in their mother's care. Assistant DA Fred Hughey said his office brought the Children's Services Division in after Mrs. Downs indicated she wanted to take Christy out of the hospital against the doctor's orders. The children's attorney, Bill Fertig, said the children need more medical treatment and as witnesses also need to be placed in the state's protective custody, particularly in light of the mother's position as a possible suspect.
They needed to make sure that these kids could receive the treatment they needed to survive. And so now Diane was really pissed. By June 3rd, Diane had hired an attorney. She was ready to take on the hospital, the city, the county, absolutely everyone. And the public and the media seemed to be backing her. Everyone was enraged that Diane was being seemingly targeted by police, that her kids had been taken from her because she was worried about them. Because again, there was this idea that no mother would ever harm her child. She had already painted this very specific picture of herself in the media. She had already created this narrative, this idea of who she was. Coworkers and friends that she had made in the last 8 weeks that she was living there also came forward, and they said Diane was a wonderful mom. She was a pleasant person in general. She brought everyone baked goods. Her children tagged along. Everyone really believed that this was a witch hunt. And in my very strong personal opinion, it is because of how quickly Diane swooped in to start the narrative and continue it. But some people in the public were starting to question things as well. There was this idea floating around that maybe Diane was involved in what happened to her children. And so an even more bizarre string of interviews began. Diane started to directly speak about the idea that she was involved, and she said it would be so bizarre for her to have committed this crime. But the way that she spoke about it even then was so unsettling. She said that if she wanted to kill her kids, she would have done a good job of it. And I just feel like that's a really weird, inappropriate way to talk about the situation.
If I had shot my own children, would I not have done a good job of it? Why would I have taken my kids to the hospital? Wouldn't I have made sure they were dead and then cried crocodile tears? That's insane to think that I would do such a thing and then bring the witnesses in against myself. That's crazy.
She started to chip away at all of the different ways in which people were questioning her story and her actions, admitting that Christy was the only child to have woken up during the attack.
And as I say, she may be the only one to get me out of this. Would I have brought her to the hospital? Wouldn't she be the one that I would make sure is dead? There are too many holes in it.
She even started to completely deny that Danny was paralyzed, which had unfortunately ended up happening. Danny was paralyzed from the chest down, but she said that if she could love him enough that he would walk again. It genuinely felt like she was slowly losing her mind, or maybe she was starting to panic enough that some of her true colors were kind of starting to come out there. And again, the patterns, the way she wouldn't stop talking, the way that she was saying the exact same phrases verbatim time and time again, it did not go unrecognized by a lot of people. It felt like if she just explained things further, the more she did interviews, the more people would believe her. It felt like she was desperately forcing her story down everyone's throats. Like she knew authorities weren't saying anything, so she had to get in every single word she possibly could to paint a picture to negate whatever they ended up eventually saying. But still in the background, the sheriff's office and the DA were building a case, and it did not seem like anyone agreed with anything. The sheriff's office felt like they wanted to go ahead and arrest Diane. The DA, Fred Hughey, was not comfortable with that. It was this back and forth struggle, but Fred Hughey was very set in the fact that he was not going to take a step further without knowing he was arresting the right person. But things so far were not looking great for Diane. They had taken a deep dive into her history, and the reality of her life was far from the one that she had so far been flaunting to the media. Diane was born August 7th, 1955 to Wesley and Willadine in Phoenix, Arizona. And she was the first of 5 children, so she was the oldest, and all of them were born in very quick succession. Willadine was 25 and all of her kids were already born. So due to the close ages of the siblings, Diane often felt neglected as there simply just was not enough time and attention to go around. And she admits this in several interviews, diary entries, statements that she made to Anne Rule for the book Small Sacrifices. It seems pretty consistent across the board that Diane expressed feelings of being unwanted and unloved as a child. And the house dynamic just in general was very restricting to her. Wesley and Willadine adhered to very strict conservative values, so the family attended church twice a week and there was no dating allowed. The children were expected to study like the dictionary during their free time, and he kind of taught them to be emotionless. And Wes has admitted this again himself. He felt he was just raising his kids to turn into strong adults by basically getting them to neglect their emotions. They weren't allowed to cry or like experience just strong emotions in general. And so again, every aspect of the house seemed to be controlled. Diane was not permitted to wear fashionable clothes, makeup, fancy jewelry, which ended up leading to pretty significant bullying. And so as a result, she not only felt rejected at home, but she also struggled to find acceptance amongst her peers. Obviously, not all of the time, but that seemed to be like the majority of her experience growing up throughout childhood, in her school years at least. Diane claimed that her mother's only interest was being a good wife. She was not focused at all on being a good mother. And so that relationship with her mom was just really lacking. It was really just an environment that felt sterile. It felt more like a military camp than a nurturing home. And then her life took a really awful turn. At the age of around 11 or 12, Diane claimed that her father started to SA her. And so this threw her into a really deep depression because she had this false understanding of love. She wanted this love. She wanted this attention from her family, specifically her parents, but this was not the kind of attention she wanted. And even her father himself has admitted that she was like 16, 17, 18. All of her kids were like almost to their adult years before he ever told them that he loved them. Absolutely wild to me as a parent. But this was the kind of attention that she got instead. And so she didn't tell anyone. She was scared of what it would do to her family. Instead, she just kind of tolerated it. Eventually, Diane was unable to sleep. She was losing weight, and this led to her needing to visit a doctor. And after the visit, where she still was too scared to tell anyone what was going on, her father took her into the desert for one of their family time moments that they would have. And this would end up being the last. Diane said that an officer pulled up behind her father and noticed when he walked up to the car that Diane was frantically putting her shirt back on. And although Diane refused to reveal what had happened, it was very clear that it had been a close call. And so her dad never attempted to do this again. But obviously, when something like that happens to you at such a young age, it is going to shape who you are in the future. And I think she held a lot of anger for her parents, for what happened to her, and she wanted to get the heck out of there. And so at the age of 15, she ended up meeting Steve Downs. Steve was older, he was a bad boy, the complete opposite of her father, which was exactly what she was looking for. He actually embodied everything that her parents disliked, which made him everything that she loved. They dated throughout high school, and for Diane, he kind of represented her ticket out of a home that she could not stand. This was her knight in shining armor. This was what love was supposed to be like, and she was going to ride off into the sunset. And so right after turning 18 years old, Diane spent the night at Steve's and didn't come home. Like, she very purposefully did this, knowing it was going to send a message to her parents. And so when her father dramatically showed up with a gun, it was decided that Diane and Steve would get married. This was exactly what Diane wanted. Their wedding took place on November 13th, 1973, but this dream escape quickly turned into an absolute nightmare.
Did your childhood affect your attitude toward men?
That has a lot to do with it. That had a lot to do with it for many, many, many years. I hated men with a passion. But yeah, I hated men for a long time. That's why I met Steve. That's why I married Steve, because Steve did not seem to be that way. Steve was always on his best behavior. He does the thing that most people do when they're dating, and that's put their best foot forward.
Yeah.
You're nice, they're punctual, they're everything they're supposed to be. And then you marry them, and it's, hey, Diane, can you let yourself in? I have to run down and look at a car.
Yeah.
That's what he did on our wedding day. Actually, I found it out the day I got married, and then within the next 2 months after that, I found out that Steve was exactly like my father. But it took me 2 years, 3 years to finally say, I can't take it anymore. He really, really is. He's not going to change. I am a person that believes that everybody's going to change for the better, given the right circumstances. If you be a good wife, if you don't nag, if you love them, if you're always there when they need them, if the food's always ready, if the house is always clean, they're going to change. He didn't change. And that's why, even though we were married for 8 years, only 3 of it was not tolerable. It wasn't tolerable, but that was the only 3 that I tried. After that, I quit because I didn't want to be married anymore.
Behind closed doors, he was just like her father, controlling, uncaring, and violent. Just weeks into their marriage, he asked Diane to iron a pair of his pants for a date that he had scheduled a month before they married, and he insisted that he felt obligated to keep it. He said this to his brand new wife, and it was stuff like that on a regular basis. Diane kind of became this human yo-yo, present when Steve wanted her, and then tossed aside when he didn't. When they would struggle financially, he would even pack Diane up and send her back to her parents on a bus, only for her to be returned with a note saying that she was now his responsibility. So I'm sure Diane felt like no one wanted her. Her parents said, not our problem anymore. Steve said, I don't really want her to be my problem either. Diane realized that she was trapped yet again, but she found a way to find happiness. Diane had always wanted children, and Steve said he did too, but obviously everything changed, and so did his thoughts on having kids. He did not want kids at the time. And so, without telling him, Diane decided to stop taking birth control and become pregnant. Again, words straight out of her mouth. Steve didn't find out that she was pregnant until she started showing. Like, she didn't share it with him at all. And this infuriated him. But Diane, on the other hand, was happier than she had ever been. She viewed her babies as an extension of herself, something that would always need her and love her unconditionally, unlike her husband and her parents. And so in 1974, Christy was born. Diane felt that Christy was her perfect baby. Christy was bubbly. She was always giggling, happy, easy to care for. Diane had originally thought that nothing could compare to being pregnant, the happiness it brought her, but holding her little baby in her arms was incredible. Diane had hoped that having a child would bring Steve back around, that he would feel the same excitement that she did, and he did initially get excited about having a baby. But once that novelty wore off, their routine just returned back to normal. Now it was Diane and Christy that were shuffled around on buses, back and forth from Diane's parents to his home, and Steve kind of danced around various jobs, doing whatever he wanted and prioritizing himself. And so in search of a better life, Diane decided to give the Air Force a try. Diane had always been incredibly smart. She excelled in school, she was almost at a genius level, and she wanted more than what she was experiencing so far. But unfortunately, her time in the Air Force lasted only a few weeks before she returned home without completing her basic training. So that too just didn't seem to be working out for her. It felt like everything that she was trying was kind of failing right in front of her face. So feeling lost, Diane made a decision. As she put it, quote, "I did the only thing I ever knew that brought happiness to my life. I got pregnant." Once again, Diane was over the moon, thrilled to have another life growing alongside her own. It was almost like this roller coaster ride where like all of life was on pause and she was just in a daze until the moment she got pregnant. And then those 9 months were just absolute bliss for her. And in 1976, Cheryl was born. However, the happiness that she felt was so short-lived because Cheryl was very different from Christy. Christy had been such a perfect baby, so calm and so quiet, so well-behaved, so sweet and loving. But Diane said from the moment Cheryl was born, she started crying and she never stopped. Cheryl was challenging. She was colicky. She wanted to be held a lot. And so it really required a lot of hands-on parenting. And so Diane and Steve decided, we're not doing this again, and Steve got a vasectomy. But despite these plans and despite their efforts to have no more children, Diane ended up pregnant yet again. It turned out that Steve was still very capable of fathering children. The vasectomy had not worked. And while Diane loved being pregnant, having actual children, like physical, living, breathing children in front of her was a very different thing. And so Diane decided this pregnancy was not going to bring her any joy. And so after a lot of soul searching, she decided to terminate the pregnancy. Initially, Diane was okay with this decision, but all of that changed about 2 years later.
And I had an abortion. Cheryl was colicky, Steve was bitching. I made Steve go back to the doctor or shut up. Don't accuse me until you know. The doctor said, yeah, you are fertile. I guess I goofed up. Come on in and we'll go ahead and do it again. Well, I was pregnant. So I was 20 years old, had 2 kids. Cheryl was colicky. My husband was a bastard. I'm sorry. And I had an abortion. And it was something that did not bother me for 2 years. And then I was at a fair in Arizona. I walked past a Right to Life booth, and they told me at the time that I aborted that I was 6 weeks. And I figured 6 weeks, that is a condition. You are not pregnant, that is a condition. It's a little ball of slime, you know, no big deal. It's a fetus is slime, I figured. I saw a 6-week fetus. That baby had arms, legs, fingers, toes, a head, eyes. That was a baby. It was a human being, and I killed it. And I felt so horrible about it that I had killed somebody like that. I didn't kill it myself, but I hired a doctor to do it.
At this point, Diane focused every ounce of energy and attention into the child that she had lost. She named this unborn baby Carrie, and she strongly felt that Carrie's soul was just out there floating in the abyss, waiting for a body to join her mom on Earth. Steve had obviously undergone this second vasectomy, and they did the testing properly this time, and it did in fact work. And so Diane had to figure out another way to have this baby, to bring Carrie, the baby she lost, back to Earth. So she legitimately went daddy shopping. Over the years, she had picked up a few jobs, and at the time, most of her colleagues were men. And so she started affairs, several of them, with these married men that she worked with, believing that she could find a suitable, quote, specimen of a father. And I know it sounds absolutely crazy that someone would do something like that someone would admit to doing something like that. So here's her admission in her own words.
And so I asked my husband to have his vasectomy changed, reversed. He refused. I asked him for a year. He kept saying no. I said, fine, I will find a suitable donor. I watched people I worked with. I picked somebody that was attractive, that was healthy, that was not abusive of drugs and alcohol and such, was strong, you know, bone structure, the whole bit, a good specimen. It was really clinical. It was really terrible. And I seduced him. And I know my cycle, and it only took once, and I got pregnant.
Actually walked in and caught them in the act. But Diane, didn't really seem to care. Their marriage was crap. He was a crap person, and she really just wanted another baby. And Steve couldn't give her that. And legitimately, within just over a week, Diane was confirmed pregnant. And in 1979, Danny was born. Diane admitted that she was disappointed that Danny was Danny because this was not her Carrie. She was supposed to have her Carrie, and she had created a, quote, completely completely different human being. And in contrast, Steve actually welcomed this baby that wasn't his own with open arms. He had actually said that if this was going to be a boy, he was going to leave her, leave both the kids. He was going to say that the two girls weren't his. And it was because he had always wanted a boy. Like with the times when she had been pregnant and he had finally accepted it, he wanted a son to carry on, I guess, the name. And he never got that. So seeing it was a boy, she thought he was for sure going to be gone. But instead, this was the son he always wanted. And honestly, this made things a lot less complicated for Diane. She kept the biological father of Danny on a string. She allowed him to visit Danny, but only really when she needed a babysitter. It became like a purely transactional kind of thing. And this poor man desperately pleaded with Diane to marry him. He's like, hey, leave this crap, leave this awful husband, be with me. We can raise Danny and your girls. Everything will be fine. But for Diane, Steve represented security. This was someone she knew. It was someone she was comfortable with, and she had no plans on leaving him. But she still never fully let go of Danny's father because she needed him there as backup. And I feel like this is really kind of when she realized the power that she could have over men. Diane at this point began to branch out towards independence, taking a job at the Chandler post office and continuing her affairs. That was something that was now like ingrained in her. She just felt so powerful, I think, having control over men, especially married ones. And so she went through a significant portion of the post office. She wasn't ashamed of it. She just kind of did her thing, felt powerful, and moved on. And that became Diane's whole existence. Finding these men, seducing these men, having these affairs, and her children got put on the back burner. For the first time in her life, she was in control of everything. She felt like she had it all together. And this seems to really be when everything started going downhill. Now, detectives had traveled to Arizona to interview those who knew Diane. It became apparent that the children really did become mere obstacles in Diane's life. She was constantly pursuing her own interests and aspirations, whether they made sense or not, and her kids seemed to be an absolute afterthought. Now that Diana kind of found this freedom for herself, most of the time her children were cared for by babysitters, while Diane was seeking attention from men. When she was home, she and Steve often argued instead of providing a loving home for the children. So really, it doesn't seem like there was any portion of these children's lives where they were in any sort of stable environment. But there were also people that spoke about occasions when Diane and Steve couldn't find a babysitter for their children, and their solution to that, in order to continue doing what they wanted to do, was to leave them at home. I mean, 6-year-old Christy was put in charge of Cheryl and Danny, who was a toddler. And this continued to be the pattern, years and years of back and forth between Diane and Steve, and finally they decided to get a divorce. But despite Diane's strong feelings against men, and her own words, she despised men, she hated them, she also couldn't seem to live without one. She quickly charmed a man at the post office, surprise, surprise, into helping her pay $5,000 to keep the house that she had shared with Steve. And this man agreed to it and moved in with his own children. However, like many that got close to Diane, he soon discovered that she was a very complex person. This charming, sweet, innocent woman could suddenly transform into someone unrecognizable. And so finally realizing the realities of Diane, what her lifestyle was like, and kind of how brutal it was, especially towards her children, this man left her. He went on to say, quote, her kids seemed like a pain in the ass to her. She feels that kids are inferior and they weren't even allowed in the living room. So now Diane is a single mother. This, situation with this man didn't work out. She got custody of the kids. So she was fully in charge, and she still was just constantly putting her own priorities before her children's. Cheryl and Christy were both in school at this point. Cheryl was in, I think, kindergarten, and Danny was being sent to daycare. Diane worked until about 2 p.m. for her postal route. And Cheryl, because she was in kindergarten, got out of school at 11:30 a.m. each day. And so from 11:30 to 2 p.m., someone would need to watch 5-year-old Cheryl. But Diane didn't want to spend the money to send Cheryl to the same daycare as Danny. So instead, neighbors reported to the police that she left Cheryl sitting on the porch of their home. Diane locked the house doors and made this 5-year-old wait outside on the steps for hours. Now, inevitably, Cheryl, 5 years old, wandered off at times in search for food, water, a bathroom, or, to play because she's a kid. And the neighbor ended up taking her under her wing. So she started to regularly, without Diane even realizing, taking Cheryl in during 11:30 to 2 to ensure that Cheryl had a safe place to stay during those hours. Several neighbors noted that after the divorce, it was clear that the kids, especially Cheryl, were just not receiving the care or attention that they needed. They were often outside or alone at home, wandering to the neighbors, asking for sandwiches and sips of water. It seemed like Diane was never home, and even when she wasn't with her children. They described these kids as being emotionally starved, as if no one had ever given them an ounce of attention throughout their lives. It ended up getting to the point where several neighbors living around Diane discussed attempting to adopt the children. Like, they thought Diane would be more than happy to get these kids out of her hair, and these neighbors were more than happy to put them into safe homes. But when things kind of reached their peak, Diane went out of town. Steve came and watched the kids for a while. And during that time, everything seemed fine. The kids looked happy. They looked well fed. So everyone kind of calmed down a bit. At some point, the neighbor that took Cheryl finally stood up to Diane about her parenting or lack thereof. And Diane exploded. She was absolutely and utterly appalled that someone would say she was neglecting her kids or leaving them in unsafe situations. And while she's kind of saying all these things like, I'm a great mother, how dare you, in the same breath, she turned to Cheryl and told Cheryl that if she wasn't able to follow mommy's rules and stay on the porch and out of trouble, then she deserved to be killed. The contradictory nature of that entire conversation is flabbergasting. At this point, most people seem to recognize that the children were in a very neglectful situation. And Diane even started to admit openly to several people that she had a problem with abusing her children. She said that she would hit them and shake them and yell at them. But she spoke about that as if that was like a normal thing for kids to experience in their childhood. And she would also say, oh yeah, but I'm working on being better as a mother. And so everyone just wasn't even sure how exactly to handle the situation. Steve also ended up telling the police that while he hadn't always been a great father, he noticed that Diane really lacked maternal instincts. She enjoyed being pregnant. She loved how she looked and felt. She loved the sense of importance and the way people treated her. However, when it came to caring for their children, her enthusiasm diminished. She didn't want kids. She wanted to feel important. Like, that was just the whole purpose for all of it. He said that she would reject Danny. She would ignore his cries for comfort as a child. She was particularly harsh with Cheryl. But despite the issues, she had full custody and no one seemed to do a single damn thing about it. As her 3 children sat neglected on the outskirts of her life, she began to devise a plan because these men that she had become involved with at work were slowly not wanting any more from her. None of them were living with her, helping to pay her bills. She was starting to kind of feel that emptiness again. And the rush of being, free, a single woman, was slowly wearing off, and she needed to fill that void. So along comes an ad for surrogacy. Diane applied to become a surrogate mother, and it's a pretty long process now. I'm sure it was still a decent process back then, and one of the things that she had to do was complete psychiatric evaluations. And so when she went to do this, she ended up failing several of them. The psychiatrists that evaluated Diane to determine if she could become a suitable surrogate mother were actually very disturbed by her. She showed signs, as they said, of psychopathy. They worried that she wouldn't actually be able to give the baby to the parents. There just seemed to be an endless list of problems they found, big red flags, but they were never able to fully label it as a specific diagnosis. They just knew that there was no way in hell she should be a surrogate mother. However, I don't know if it was by the strings of the company in charge of the surrogacy or if it was by Diane, but another private evaluation ended up being done, keyword private, and they gave Diane the all clear. And so she went on to carry a baby for a couple. And God, did this feed her ego. Diane ended up being interviewed on a TV show about being a surrogate mother. She was praised for her selflessness. She really felt like she was about to become the face of surrogacy. She was sure that fame was headed her way. So in 1982, she gave birth to a little girl. She collected her $10,000 and immediately booked for another surrogacy. Her life at this point was the best it had ever been. She felt like she had a purpose. She had found a way to just repeatedly get pregnant, but not actually have to deal with the children. And so she was on cloud nine. And it was around this time that she got particularly close with Robert Knickerbocker, who went by the name of Nick, the same man from the rose tattoo and the same man from the pictures on top of her TV. So police at this point had obviously located him, and they wanted to talk to him because Steve had said this was someone that she had had an affair with for a year prior to the shooting. She also had been nonstop writing to him in her diary, and they felt he might at very least again have information to help them. And he had a whole lot to say. First and foremost, he noted that she called him at 7 a.m. on May 20th. So after all of this happened to Diane, after her children had been shot, after she lost her daughter, she didn't even call and speak to Steve. Even if he was a terrible husband, these were their kids, his daughter died, she didn't think to call him a single time, but instead she immediately ran to Nick. He had been denying her phone calls at this point, which I will absolutely get into in a minute, but she had told the people at the post office, because that's where she called to reach him, that this was an emergency. But when he first got to the phone, she was like, "Hey, how are you? I've missed you." It was just this very casual conversation, and he had to be like, "Diane, what is going on? Like, why is this an emergency?" And she says, "Oh yeah, I've been shot and so have the kids." Like, it just seemed like this afterthought. The first and foremost was, how is Nick? Is he okay? Are they okay? She hasn't spoken to him. She misses him. And so again, that in and of itself should speak volumes about Diane and her priorities. Now, Nick worked for the Chandler post office with Diane, and the two of them and another employee, I guess, were kind of known as being the most efficient workers. So that's really how they, I guess, initially met. But Diane, in her late pregnancy, third trimester, and Nick, after an injury, ended up being forced together in close quarters at the office, away from their typical solitary routes, which meant that they spent a lot of time together. And considering the fact that Diane would show up to work in like Daisy Duke shorts, like teeny tiny shorts, and white crop tops with no bra on that showed her underboob, he had a great time spending time in the office with her. Now, Nick was married and had recently moved to Arizona to follow his wife's dreams. And unfortunately, he was not taking to the change as well as he had hoped. And so he was looking for something to cheer him up. And Diane, being Diane, absolutely loved a married man. The two of them began to have an affair. And Nick thought, this is just going to be a quick pick-me-up. Diane was well known as making quick rounds with the men in the office, and so he figured this was going to be short, sweet, discreet, but boy, was he so very wrong. Diane, being well-versed in affairs, had arranged all of their meetings. Everything was going great, but eventually she started to tell Nick that she wanted to marry him, and Nick was like, wait a minute, this was not supposed to go this far. And so he repeatedly told her that he had no plans of leaving his wife. Like, this had been something they laid the groundwork for in the beginning. Like, their expectations were settled from the start. This was a fling. It was fun, and that was it. But the problem is that when you told something to Diane that she didn't want to hear, no, you didn't. Diane had this unique ability to rearrange memories to fit her desired scenarios. She would analyze what people said or the situations that arose, and then would twist them to align with her expectations. And so no matter how many times Nick told Diane, this is not going to happen, I'm not leaving my wife, we're not going to be together, she simply refused to believe it. Nick told authorities that he found himself in a very tricky situation. And just by the way, when authorities were questioning him about this, his wife was right there. Like, he had already told her everything. So I cannot even begin to fathom how uncomfortable of a situation it was having this interview. But it seems like at some level, Diane understood that Nick didn't want this. And so she started to do things that put him in a position where he felt kind of trapped. Diane started to openly discuss their affair with everybody at work. Like, it was a thing that everyone knew about, which I'm sure they didn't want to know about. And she also began to boldly put herself in front of his wife. Like, she showed up to a company barbecue and smashed her food down and just stared Nick's wife in the eyes across the table. As Anne Rule put it in her book, quote, he couldn't get off the merry-go-round. It was like this constant threat that she would just tip the whole table over the moment he tried to get away from her. Now, reading Diane's diaries revealed a lot to authorities. It revealed just how out of touch she was in this affair. She dismissed every single time Nick left her, but she would always find reasons as to why it happened. She would claim that it was just his wife manipulating him, or that he was doing it to make his divorce look better. She would somehow concoct these explanations to justify the actions in any situation in a way that was always favorable to her. So in the year leading up to the shooting, this was the kind of mindset Diane was in. And so you might wonder why any of this matters. It just sounds like I am like divulging someone's deepest, darkest secrets for no reason. However, it's significant because it offers a motive for Diane to potentially harm her own children. For the first time in Diane's life, it seems like she was wildly obsessed with a man. She was deeply in love, far beyond the facade that she had usually maintained. Or perhaps she was just simply enthralled by the challenge itself, taking him from another woman, breaking down his desires to conform to hers instead of her being the one always being forced to conform. I'm sure there's like so many different psychological ways she could have been approaching this situation. But clearly something with Nick was different, and she actively wanted him to permanently be in her life. And the one thing that stood between her and Nick being together, even more than his wife, was her children.